Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a historical stack of sources and pushing them right up against the most fragile moment in any nation's life, the moment of its founding. We're not just looking at the birth of a modern state, but specifically how governance is forged in that crucible of extreme existential crisis.
And how executive authority is established when the ground is literally shaking beneath your feet. This is, an essential study in constitutional ethics and political restraint. For those of you who study state formation, you know that the temptation during an existential crisis is always there.
To just grab power.
To grab power, exactly. To bypass law for the sake of speed, for the sake of survival. We're going to examine a crucial historical case where the leader intentionally chose the opposite path.
And our focus today is on the founding of Pakistan and the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah as its first Governor General. We're specifically drawing from the profound insights in the research detailed in The Disciplined Hand, Jinnah's executive power and rule of law.
Which is rooted in the scholarship of Zaheer Ahmad Meer.
Yes, a constitutional and corporate lawyer and a really keen analyst of post-colonial governance.
And Meer's research, it moves beyond just, simple political history. It provides a kind of constitutional diagnosis of a state at birth.
A diagnosis, I like that.
Yeah. We're looking at a system in embryo and how the actions of one leader set the foundational legal ethic before any institutions could really mature. It's a blueprint for understanding whether a state will operate under the rule of law or the rule of individual authority.
Okay, so let's unpack this with a clear mission.
Yeah.
What are we trying to prove or extract from these foundational chaotic moments?
Well, we aim to explore how Jinnah navigated the absolute chaos of the state's birth. The central mission is really to answer this question. How did he manage to transform what should have been an irresistible justification for authoritarian rule?
I mean, he had every excuse.
Every excuse in the book.
Yeah.
4 simultaneous, overwhelming national crises. How did he turn that into a profound lesson in restrained constitutional governance?
And the sources seem to suggest the answer lies entirely in one word: discipline.
Exactly. The core revelation is that true, enduring power, the kind that builds a state rather than merely ruling it, rests in moral and legal restraint.
Not just in the sheer authority granted by the office.
Precisely. His decisions in that first fragile year shaped Pakistan's earliest constitutional ethic. They demonstrated that even overwhelming necessity had to be disciplined by strict legality.
That concept, discipline, applied to necessity. That's far more complex than just saying he followed the rule.
Oh, much more.
It suggests a conscious strategic choice to make the survival of the rule of law paramount to even the most pressing immediate political or security threat.
It is the strategic choice. It's the choice between establishing a temporary dictatorship for survival versus laying the groundwork for a permanent, legitimate order. That intellectual framework is really the key insight we need to carry forward into this.
Okay, so let's immerse ourselves in the reality of August 1947. This wasn't some planned, orderly independence celebration.
Not at all.
It was an hour of extreme fragility. To fully appreciate Jinnah's restraint, we have to first understand the absolute administrative void that Pakistan inherited.
And when we say void, we are talking about a unique historical situation. I mean, unlike many colonial transitions where the departing power left a semi-functional skeleton of a state apparatus.
Something to work with.
Right, something. The partition process was so rushed and so violent that Pakistan inherited virtually nothing that was tested or cohesive or organized for the task of independent modern governance.
And it's easy to forget. The legal framework he was working with was essentially the Adapted Government of India Act of 1935.
Which was intended for a different United India.
Exactly. And now it was just crudely repurposed for a brand new divided reality.
That's a crucial detail. So he had a legal framework, but he didn't have the infrastructure to enforce it. Imagine having the blueprint for a skyscraper, but the site is a pile of rubble and half your engineers have just quit. The state started with a theoretical legal basis for authority, but administratively it faced 3 critical immediate voids.
Okay, let's detail those 3 points the sources emphasize, starting with just the nuts and bolts of government operation.
The first void was the lack of any tested administrative machinery. The civil service had been massively split along communal lines.
So people just left.
They left. Files and physical assets were divided, often haphazardly. Experienced civil servants, especially those trained for the most complex tasks of finance and defense, were often scarce or physically unavailable due to the migration.
So what does that mean in practice?
It means departments responsible for revenue, communication, supply, they simply stopped functioning.
Yeah.
Or they operated at a minimal, untrained capacity. It's impossible to govern when your bureaucracy doesn't know where its office is or who its boss is.
And without administration, you can't fund anything.
Hmm.
Which brings us to the second void, the fiscal system.
Precisely. There was no established independent fiscal system. Think about the basics. A functioning treasury, the infrastructure for currency control, or even the ability to collect and manage taxation across new borders.
They had to start from absolute scratch.
From scratch. Economic survival was immediate and precarious. If the government couldn't manage its budget, it couldn't pay the small number of civil servants it did have, nor could it purchase vital supplies for the millions of displaced persons flowing in. This wasn't a fiscal downturn. It was an absolute structural non-existence.
Which just compounds the security crisis, the third void.
Absolutely. The defense structure was fragmented. Military units had to be physically reconstituted based on personnel choices, and loyalty and supplies had to be organized overnight.
So when the violence erupted,
Which it did, immediately. Widespread border violence, internal rioting. The new state had no cohesive, pre-organized military or police force ready to respond effectively. The potential for total security collapse was immediate and overwhelming.
so if we step back, the state's survival wasn't a matter of implementing policy. It was a matter of sheer, instantaneous crisis management.
That's it.
The vacuum of power demanded immediate, decisive executive action. But where did that authority come from if the institutions just didn't exist?
And that's the crux of Meer's analysis. If Jinnah, as the head of the executive, had hesitated, or if his directives had been seen as mere suggestions, the whole structure would have just dissolved.
Like a falling apart.
The vacuum demanded a singularity of purpose and power, but, and this is the key, that power had to be immediately legitimate. Otherwise, it would just provoke resistance rather than compliance.
And this leads to that fascinating observation that Jinnah became the law itself, the living constitution.
Yes.
Zaheer Ahmad Meer writes, "At the moment of birth, Pakistan's constitution was unwritten, yet Jinnah's discipline made it functional." Let's dig into the mechanism of that legitimacy.
It's a really powerful idea. In the absence of a fully operational judiciary, a stabilized legislature, or tested administrative rules, Jinnah's personal conduct, it served as the primary guarantor of legality.
People trusted him.
They trusted him. Therefore, his discipline movements, his every decision, became the immediately enforceable norm.
So his legitimacy wasn't derived from a piece of paper, the way it would be in an established state. It was derived from a consensus of moral authority and political commitment.
Exactly. So how did this translate into practical governance? It meant that his personal discipline was the state's foundation. For an order to be effective, it had to be seen as not just an order, but a lawful, necessary order.
So if he had acted arbitrarily even once,
If he had seized private assets without due process, for example, or rewarded a supporter through some non-legal mechanism, it would have instantly undermined the moral basis for the state's entire existence.
wow.
He had to embody the restraint and legality that the physical infrastructure of the state could not yet enforce.
So he served as both the symbol of the new state and its operational safeguard, the living constitution in motion. It just implies a crushing personal burden on the founder.
An immense burden. He was setting the constitutional tone not through philosophical treaties, but through the daily, minute details of governance. Every administrative appointment, every resource allocation, every military directive. It was all scrutinized by the populace and the remaining bureaucracy, not just for its content, but for its adherence to a higher unspoken law of fairness and discipline.
So let's move into 1947-48. The executive is facing this onslaught of overlapping crises. We need to detail the pressure cooker environment Jinnah was operating in, because this makes his choice of restraint even more remarkable.
Yes, and the crises were not sequential. That's the key. They were simultaneous and compounding.
On top of each other.
Yes, creating what constitutional lawyers call a state of exception, where normally emergency powers would completely override civil government.
Okay, so what were the main concurrent pressures?
First and foremost, the massive refugee influx. Estimates vary, but we are talking about millions of people crossing borders.
Billions.
Needing immediate and total support shelter, food, medical attention, resettlement. This completely overwhelmed every resource available.
And on top of that, you have the administrative collapse we just talked about.
Right, a comprehensive collapse. Law enforcement, judiciary, tax collection, all had broken down or were operating in a state of chaos.
Then you had the violence and political instability.
Yes. Widespread border warfare, especially concerning Kashmir, and severe internal security issues across Punjab and Sindh, exacerbated by communal violence and the breakdown of communication.
And finally, you had provincial instability and political tensions.
Exactly. New provincial governments, inexperienced and overwhelmed, often resisted federal guidance, seeing it potentially as a power grab rather than necessary crisis aid.
Any historian would argue that this situation provides the perfect textbook justification for an autocratic response.
Oh, absolutely.
A total suspension of civil government in favor of military rule or personal decree. I mean, necessity was screaming at the executive to take shortcuts.
And this is where we hit the critical choice. Legality over arbitrariness. The sources emphasize that Jinnah exercised executive power with incredible firmness. He solved problems, appointed new administrators, moved resources, but he did so, crucially, within established legal boundaries.
How did he manage that? Given the administrative vacuum we just described, what was the source of his legal power during this time?
He consciously anchored his authority in the Adapted Government of India Act of 1935, which was functioning as the provisional constitution.
Okay.
That act contained provisions for the Governor General to act, but always through legal instruments, ordinances, statutory rules, or executive orders rooted in law. He actively refused to let the pervasive chaos justify arbitrary rule or the suspension of those legal norms.
So instead of simply declaring, this is my will, which, I mean, he arguably could have done given his political capital.
He could have.
He said, this is an ordinance duly promulgated under Section X of the 1935 Act.
Precisely. And this is the difference between a personal decree and a legal instrument. A personal decree is temporary, it's tied to the person issuing it. A legal instrument, even if it's passed quickly, is codified. It's subject to later review, and it provides a template for future legal action.
He governed by paper trail.
A paper trail, ensuring every order, whether it was to seize abandoned property or allocate emergency funds, had a constitutional reference point.
That must have slowed things down in the short term. I mean, it requires more coordination, more consultation, more legal input. Why take the slower, harder path?
Because the goal was not just to survive the next 6 months. It was to establish a nation that would endure for generations.
All right.
Every directive issued bore constitutional reasoning, which was essential to prevent the new state from operating under the rule of men. He was sending an unambiguous message to the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and the world. This state is founded on law, and the executive is subordinate to it.
That distinction becomes the foundational constitutional ethic. How does Meer summarize this crucial balance between power and constraint?
Meer's analysis captures it perfectly. Even necessity was disciplined by legality. This restraint is the birth moment of Pakistan's earliest constitutional ethic.
So Jinnah understood that using the crisis as a justification to discard law, even for humanitarian reasons, would establish a fatal precedent.
A fatal precedent. The short-term efficiency of dictatorship would create long-term constitutional fragility. It would make future leaders feel entitled to ignore the law whenever they deemed a situation necessary.
You know, the lesson for anyone listening, regardless of your field, is that your greatest strength, even in a panic, lies in restraint. The most powerful choice is the disciplined one.
It speaks to the integrity of the system itself. If the founding moment demonstrated that the law is disposable, then the law has no inherent authority. By choosing legality, Jinnah gave the law its ultimate sacred authority, tested and proven in the fires of crisis.
Okay, let's pivot now to the first major political test of this ethic, the relationship between the center and the provinces. We know the administrative machinery broke down unevenly. When the provinces struggled, the federal government had to step in.
Right.
And this is the moment where new states so often slide into hypercentralization.
Absolutely. The sources talk about early tensions, particularly in provinces like Sindh and Punjab, which were just overwhelmed by refugee traffic, administrative desertions, and local political infighting.
A total mess.
Total mess. The law and order situation, combined with the collapse of the food supply chain, meant the central government had to intervene.
So what was the critical distinction Jinnah drew in the nature of his intervention?
It is so critical to note that his goal was not centralization of power or imposing federal control for its own sake. Had it been, he could have easily used the crisis to remove political rivals or install compliant local administrations permanently.
He didn't.
He didn't. Instead, his primary mandate was explicitly to restore constitutional machinery that had broken down under the strain of the crisis. He acted as a mechanic, not a landlord.
Can we get specific? What did these interventions actually look like? Did he send in federal troops? Did he, fire cabinets?
The intervention was surgical. For example, in provinces that were struggling severely with the refugee crisis and lawlessness, Jinnah sometimes used his authority as governor general to appoint temporary, highly trusted federal administrators.
Not politicians.
No, often civil servants known for their nonpartisan discipline, and they were there to oversee specific functions like refugee relief coordination or ensuring the police force was adequately supplied.
And the key was?
The key was that these actions were temporary, they were targeted, and they were focused entirely on administrative repair, not political subjugation. The provincial assemblies were maintained.
That requires massive trust in the people implementing the orders. Because if the officers on the ground are corrupt or biased, the intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, instantly turns into domination.
That's why Jinnah spent so much time addressing the administrative arm directly. We have that powerful archival quote from his address to civil officers in February 1948,
Right.
where he defined the very essence of their job in a fragile state. He said, "Authority is a trust. You must exercise it with justice and without fear or favor."
Authority is a trust. That statement fundamentally changes the executive role from one of wielding power to one of guardianship.
It does.
So what was the practical implication of that philosophy for, say, a district commissioner trying to manage a riot or a supply shortage?
It meant that every officer, from the highest secretary to the lowest constable, was acting as a constitutional guardian, not a political operative. They knew their mandate was to be impartial and just, even when allocating incredibly scarce resources like food aid or land for resettlement, where the temptation to favor one's own faction was intense.
And this prevented necessary federal intervention from degenerating into political opportunism or factional conflict.
That's right.
I really appreciate the analogy the source provides here, which clarifies the distinction perfectly. Jinnah used power like a physician to heal the system, not to dominate it.
That analogy is so effective because it emphasizes the temporary restorative nature of the action. A physician intervenes with a temporary measure, a stitch, a cast, surgery, to allow the body to regain its natural independent function.
So he was restoring the capacity of the provinces to govern themselves legally.
Yes, not absorbing their functions into the federal structure permanently. This approach was vital for building a functional, if decentralized, federal state in the long run.
So it sets a critical precedent. Federal strength is derived not from crushing local autonomy, but from supporting the constitutional structures when they falter.
Which is a subtle but profound difference from what happened in so many other post-colonial states. It requires an unusual degree of self-control from the central authority. When you have the capacity to take over and impose your will, choosing instead the difficult path of constitutional repair, getting the broken machinery working again, and then stepping back, that is the ultimate act of disciplined strength.
This governance style, this emphasis on constitutional repair over authoritarian takeover, it wasn't accidental, was it? It was rooted in Jinnah's background.
Not at all.
He was a constitutional lawyer leading a revolution. How did his deep practical knowledge of constitutional law set him apart from future leaders who might have lacked that technical grounding?
Well, his legal training meant his crisis management was inherently structured by legal foresight. He didn't just view problems as isolated political or security challenges. He viewed them as opportunities to establish jurisprudence.
So his decisions were calculated constitutional precedents.
They were. Unlike leaders who react purely on political instinct, Jinnah understood the long-term systemic legal fallout of every single maneuver. He was always asking, what does this decision mean for the rule of law a decade from now?
And the sources highlight the strongest evidence of this commitment by showing us the concrete actions he avoided.
Yes.
These choices, the paths not taken, they truly reveal his commitment to constitutional morality. Let's expand on the three examples of profound restraint.
The first, and perhaps the most critical, was his absolute refusal to use martial powers.
Which would have been the easy button.
The easiest button. In a state engulfed by violent internal upheaval, massive refugee flow, and border conflict, declaring martial law across wide swaths of the country would have been the fastest, seemingly most logical way to restore immediate order. Yet he refused.
Why was this refusal so difficult and so important?
It was difficult because the civil police and administration were genuinely collapsing in many areas. The pressure from security forces and overwhelmed local officials to hand over the reins to the military must have been immense.
Of course.
And it was important because martial law immediately suspends civil liberties, places the military above the judiciary, and crucially, it establishes a precedent that when things get tough, the Constitution is irrelevant.
So by avoiding it.
By avoiding it, Jinnah asserted that the civil judiciary and the provisional legal framework, the 1935 Act, remains supreme, even under fire.
That choice cements judicial independence right at the founding moment. Amazing. What was the second major act of restraint?
He refused to suspend provincial assemblies. Despite the extreme instability in some provinces and the clear challenges some provincial governments posed to central authority, often because they were failing to manage the crisis, Jinnah maintained the legislative structure.
He kept them in place.
He kept them in place. This ensured that the democratic legitimacy of the state, however messy or dysfunctional, was preserved. He prioritized functioning within the mess over imposing clean, autocratic control.
Which speaks volumes about his commitment to democracy, even when democracy is wildly inconvenient during a crisis.
Yes.
And the third choice, concerning political opposition, this one really speaks to the temperament of a founding leader.
It does. He never used the state of emergency as an excuse to silence dissent or political opposition.
Which is almost unheard of.
It is. The crisis was massive. The state was fighting for its life against both internal and external threats. In almost any other post-colonial context facing this level of existential threat, political debate would have been suppressed as sedition or unpatriotic. Jinnah allowed criticism and disagreement to continue.
And that allowance for political expression is the bedrock of future political stability. It suggests he had enough confidence in the state's legitimacy that he didn't need to fear debate.
Exactly. And this profound commitment to restraint stands in stark contrast to the actions of later rulers who, as the sources note, mistook necessity for license. They inherited the political stability Jinnah created, but they often ignored the constitutional discipline he modeled. They saw Jinnah's initial success in crisis management and assumed the lesson was merely act quickly, failing to grasp the crucial legal caveat. Jinnah acted quickly and decisively, but always within the bounds of law.
This brings us back to the definition of constitutional morality. Meer's argument here is so powerful.
It is. Meer articulates the core principle. Jinnah taught that constitutional morality is tested not in comfort, but in crisis. It's easy to be moral when there's no pressure.
Right.
The true test of a constitutional system and the character of its leader is revealed when survival seems to require bending or breaking those rules. Jinnah used the crisis to reinforce the rules, treating constitutional adherence as the primary method of survival.
So what is the lasting implication of this for the listener? We are talking about a powerful legacy that the sources describe as least practiced.
The implication is that this principle that crisis demands adherence to a higher impartial law is Pakistan's most powerful yet least practiced legacy. It was the founding DNA. If that DNA had been consistently replicated by successors, the nation's history might have been constitutionally steadier.
Right.
The fact that the model was so difficult to sustain shows the fragility of legal traditions when they rely heavily on the individual character of leaders rather than on deeply ingrained institutional checks and balances.
So Jinnah provided a roadmap, but subsequent political generations prioritized political convenience over constitutional rigor.
He demonstrated that disciplined power is the only kind that can build legitimacy. But discipline is hard work. When the acute crisis passed, the temptation of convenience, of shortcuts, of executive overreach, it proved too strong for many who followed.
Okay, so let's synthesize Jinnah's philosophy of leadership. When we pull all these pieces together, the rejection of martial law, the refusal to suspend assemblies, the adherence to legal instruments, how did he ultimately define authority?
For Jinnah, authority was defined by its relationship to service and law. It was not a personal trophy or a tool for maximizing control. It was service that was inherently bound by law.
Meaning if the exercise of authority wasn't serving the people within that legal framework, it was.
It was, by definition, illegitimate. This intellectual framework guided his every single action.
His objectives were therefore not merely survival, but fundamentally systemic. Let's use his powerful quote that frames his executive work.
He famously said, "We must not forget that we are building not a country, but a system of justice."
That's just a monumental statement for a leader struggling to literally keep the lights on and the border secure.
It is.
It implies that every resource allocation, every military mobilization, was not merely an administrative necessity, but an action fundamentally aimed at institutionalizing fairness and impartiality.
It reframes the entire mission. When your goal is building a system of justice, then chaos management and constitutional adherence become the same task.
They're one and the same.
Exactly. You manage the crisis by building the legal framework that prevents future injustice. This gave all his executive actions an immediate, moral, and enduring legal weight that went far beyond mere political expediency.
So let's review the outcome of this moral discipline. It's counterintuitive. How did choosing the slower legal path actually lead to functional government, rather than slowing it down or risking collapse?
The sources show that restraint was actually the catalyst for functional governance. First, his restraint gave immediate and widespread legitimacy to executive decisions.
Okay, how?
Because Jinnah was known to operate strictly within the law, using legal instruments and respecting due process, even the toughest decisions, like enforcing property laws or intervening in provincial affairs, were accepted as necessary and legal, not as the whim of a nascent dictator.
Acceptance and trust are the currency of a fragile state. That credibility is far more valuable than raw coercive power, which always requires force to sustain it.
Absolutely. His humility and discipline gave those decisions credibility among the domestic populace, the civil service, and crucially, the international community watching the birth of this new state. When the leader avoids personal glory and adheres strictly to the rule of law, the people and the nascent bureaucracy trust the system being established.
So power in his hands was viewed as a moral act, as clean power.
Clean power, yes. And this brings us to the final, powerful synthesis from Zaheer Ahmad Meer regarding the ultimate meaning of this era of foundational governance.
What's the final word?
Meer concludes that this period demonstrates a powerful truth. Jinnah's power did not corrupt. It created order. He proved that in governance, restraint is the highest form of strength.
That is the definitive takeaway for this entire deep dive. At the exact moment where maximum scope existed for unchecked, arbitrary power, the choice to pursue legal restraint was the strategic decision that allowed the fragile state to establish order and survive that existential threat.
He set an ethical ceiling for the executive. He could have taken shortcuts and perhaps saved lives faster in some isolated incidents, but the cost would have been the legitimacy and ultimate survival of the rule of law. He chose the enduring path of legitimacy over temporary expediency.
So we've explored how in Pakistan's most fragile hour, the first governor-general managed to be decisive yet disciplined, authoritative yet restrained, creating a unique historical case study in political character under fire.
The core lesson here is truly universal. In the most fragile hour of statehood, Jinnah demonstrated that leadership is not about maximizing control. It is fundamentally about conscience and adherence to the higher law.
The state survived, not because its ruler was the strongest man,
but because its first ruler viewed himself as the first servant of the law.
This principle, that constitutional morality is tested in crisis, it leaves us with a provocative final thought. We saw that the disciplined use of power in a founding moment was essential for survival and establishing the state's ethical DNA.
So the question then becomes one of political endurance and memory. How does the disciplined use of power in a founding moment affect a nation's ability to tolerate and survive future non-existential political crises?
Right. If the legal foundation is built on restraint, does that immunity to authoritarianism last?
Or does the disciplined governance of the founder merely buy time, requiring every succeeding generation of leaders to rediscover and practice that same moral restraint for the system to remain functional?
It suggests that the character of the founder provides a moral and legal inheritance. But the lack of character or discipline in successive rulers can quickly erode even the most solid legal foundations. It leaves us wondering about the nature of political tradition and the perpetual struggle to preserve constitutional norms against the siren call of convenience.
Indeed. It's a reminder that governance is not a structure you finish building. It is a constitutional ethic that must be perpetually practiced and defended by every generation of leaders and citizens alike.
We hope this deep dive into executive power in a fragile hour has given you a profound appreciation for the crucial, often unseen choices that shape the destiny of nations. Thank you for joining us.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.